Welcome back to more underrated history. This is Jason coming at you here because I promised yesterday that I would have a Nazi general featured today. And so here we go. There is actually one general in the Nazi side who Hitler actually couldn't stand. Now, given the pettiness that could happen within the inner circle of the Third Reich, this isn't entirely a surprise. But the reasons are. And so today I'm introducing everybody to Gotthard Heinrici, who was an army general, or the Wehrmacht general, who was part of Army Group Center, I believe it was, or was it Army Group North? But either way, one of those two. He was part of that invading force into the Soviet Union. And they wound up being part of Army Group Vistula, which is what happened when those two army groups got whittled down so far that they had to be merged into one. Now, Army Group Vistula was responsible for the defense of the German homeland. Now, what Heinrici was able to accomplish was this. He didn't stop the invasion. Obviously, the Soviets got to Berlin and killed off the Third Reich entirely. But what Heinrici did, and he believed this with every fiber of his being, was that he wanted to make... He was the most brilliant, probably, defensive general in the entire war. And his belief was to make the invading force pay dearly for every inch that they gained. Now, the Soviet army and the Red Army was so massively big, and they had such massive amounts of resources that being able to entirely stop them was entirely impossible. Particularly at this particular stage of the war, the Soviets were getting stronger and the Germans were getting weaker, and Heinrici had to try to hold the ground until eventually they got the Soviets reached the battles being fought on German soil in an area that is called the Silo Heights, which is an area just east of Berlin. Kind of overlooks the flat plain that Berlin sits on. And where Hitler really learned how to despise this man is that once I got to this point, he was close enough that he could personally visit the Führer bunker in the middle of Berlin himself. And so he did. And one thing that he did that men around Hitler's inner circle did not do was tell the truth. Told the truth about the horrible situation that they're in, and that, at the point of his visit to the Führer bunker, he told Hitler that the Red Army would be at his bunker within 24 hours. And, Hitler was ordering these imaginary invasions with panzer armies that were non-existent by this point. Heinrici had to tell him that they didn't exist. You're ordering pincer movements with armies that are not even there anymore. And so the disillusion within that concrete bunker was so big that anybody coming in to tell him, his immediate inner circle did not want to tell him the truth. But the reason why Heinrici is so forgotten in history, I think there's a historian that I read about that summed it up pretty well. And that is, Heinrici had the charisma of a 20-pound sack of potatoes. Didn't make any bold proclamations, didn't pursue headlines. He just wanted to do his job. And with what he had, he did the best he possibly could. Slow down the Soviet advance enough to where if Hitler and his band of deluded cronies by this point decided they wanted to get out of Berlin and maybe get to the Bavarian Alps, they would have had enough time to do it if they wanted to. So Heinrici made them pay for it. Now, the other person that Heinrici visited in this... let me go back a little bit here. In his bunker visit, Heinrici gave Hitler the total truth about what was going on here. And on a prior visit, he told them that, it would only be a couple weeks before the Soviets were at the gates of Berlin. And so what happened at this point was what Heinrici later called the auction. And it involved Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, promising 10,000 Luftwaffe pilots to help with the defense of Berlin. Karl Dönitz, the head of the Navy, offering 10,000 naval shipmen to back him up with the for the defense of the city. Heinrich Himmler had the greatest promise of all: 100,000 soldiers from the SS to help with the defense of the city. Now, what Heinrici said after all these men were trying to curry Hitler's favor with these very unrealistic promises, but he leveled with him, Hitler, and said, "Hey, look, these are not men trained in trench warfare," which they weren't. You know, you've got naval soldiers, pilots, and basically, security staff, the SS. These were not people who were trained in defensive trench warfare. These were soldiers that were going to get ripped to shreds. And unfortunately, as things turn out later on, not only did these numbers not materialize for Hitler, but the ones that did, that's exactly what happened. They got absolutely shredded and blasted within the city limits of Berlin. Now, is Heinrici really a hero? I would say no. He doesn't get a pass on many things. A lot of war crimes that happened from his army groups against Soviet soldiers and Soviet civilians happened under his watch, so he doesn't get a pass for that. But Hitler, when it came down to it, when it came to the defense of Berlin, with whatever was left of his Wehrmacht, he had a choice to make. He had a choice to either choose somebody who would tell him whatever his itching ears wanted to hear, or would tell him whatever he wanted to hear and get ran over and flattened, or would he choose Heinrici for the defense and be told everything he couldn't stand to hear, but possibly have a chance? I mean, he had about as much of a chance as I do of becoming an elected pope, but it was still a chance. And so that's how that went. Now, the important thing to remember about Heinrici, his wife was half Jewish and was personally protected by Hitler with some declarations that basically declared them Aryan, even though his wife wasn't. And so his children were also a quarter Jewish as a result. He had 2 children. And Hitler kept them protected from persecution because he knew he needed this general for military purposes. So he was protecting a man he really didn't like. But he didn't have much of a choice when push came to shove the way the war was going by 1943 and 1944. Which is the timeline in which all this occurred. Now, the other thing about Heinrici to remember is he never joined the Nazi Party. You gotta remember, he served in World War I. So he was part of the military coming out of that and never had any loyalty to the Nazi Party, because when he joined the German military in the 1910s during World War I, started as a low-level sergeant and clearly worked his way up during the Weimar Republic years of the 1920s. He was already entrenched in the army by the time Hitler was named Chancellor in 1933. So he came in with military credentials, but never established any loyalty to Hitler politically or to the Nazi Party. He was never a member. So Heinrici never, although he did under his watch, a lot of the atrocities against Jews happened, and against Soviet civilians and soldiers occurred under his watch. Any thought of him being responsible for the Holocaust is actually ridiculous. I would venture to say that he did not know about what was going on with the Holocaust until the last year of the war. By which point he had reached the point where, along with a lot of other people within Germany, felt they had to fight on, because otherwise, after all the atrocities that his army inflicted on the Soviets, they weren't going to be given any grace by the Red Army. Nobody was, including himself. So they fought on, knowing that it was kind of a choice of death by which way. Do you want to be killed in the battle, or do you want to be killed by execution or firing squad from the Red Army? So I believe that was his motivation for continuing in 1945, up until the surrender, and finally when his army group Wichel was defeated in defending Berlin in April of 1945. But the unfortunate thing is that everything that he told Hitler, everything that he told in that bunker about the state, and that how the Russian army would completely destroy whatever reinforcements were given, every prediction that he made on that front proved to be historically 100% accurate. He was dead on. He wasn't giving a strategy plan. He was basically declaring a death sentence on his own country and his own army, because he knew what was coming. This was a smart man. Not a particularly charismatic man, but a very intelligent man. And he fought on because, for the same reason why everybody else did in the Wehrmacht and the rest of the German military, they didn't feel like they had much of a choice. And practically, given the way the Russians and the Red Army were treated, as the Germans went through and into Russia, as atrocious as it sounds, as barbaric as it sounds, you could understand why they took that point, or took that stand. That they were going to basically push it right back in the Germans' faces, the pain and suffering that was inflicted upon them. Now, there was one meeting that happened before any of this defense of Berlin occurred. And it came when Heinrici was called to the palace of Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, and basically, by law, the second in command of the Third Reich. And Goering remembered Heinrici's assessment of his Luftwaffe forces and pilots in terms of trench combat. Needless to say, Goering was pissed. So he called Heinrici to his house, which is called Karenhall, which was named after his first wife. He was a widower. So, first thing Heinrici said when he came in was, "My God, this place is palatial. It's huge." He's like, my soldiers are out there dying of lack of rations and lack of resources, and here's this inner circle, actual World War I hero himself, Hermann Goering, living a life of luxury that would have been atrocious even in peacetime. I mean, this guy was living like Jeff Bezos, without any of the economic boost or production. All he did was take. And take he did. This palace was lined with artworks that were seized by soldiers from the occupied territories when the Germans were still advancing. It was a collector of artworks, and actually made an outrageous amount of money doing so. It had palatial wealth. Imagine if an army general these days, like even the Secretary of the Defense in the United States these days, imagine if Pete Hegseth had a palatial mansion the size of Bill Gates. Don't get me wrong, he lives nice, but not like this, not like Goering did. So Heinrici shows up at the palace, and this is not a matter of hospitality. He really didn't want to go. I mean, why would you want to go? Because he knew what was coming up next. Goering felt like he was backed into a corner, and he knew that Goering would be, it could be poisonous if cornered, kind of like a cornered cat or a tiger or a lion. But that said, Goering went on a tirade about how he observed Heinrici's soldiers doing nothing while waiting for an assault to come in. They're basically slackers and slacking off while waiting for the next wave to come in. And Heinrici, of course, is getting pissed off himself, and he finished their meal. The tension was obviously in the air, and the reason why we know this story is because Heinrici survived the war. So he left Hall. He turned around and looked back at Goering and dropped the biggest verbal bomb of anybody in World War II. And that verbal bomb went like this: I sure hope my slackers can defend this fabulous or fantastic palace. It would be a shame to lose it. That was a verbal jab, a one-liner that hits the target dead center. In fact, it hit so hard that Goering would not wind up even trying to defend the palace, because the verbal jab had hit so hard that even he realized at that point that they were not going to be able to save it. And so what happened later, after this meeting, after Heinrici went back to the front, was that Goering wound up setting his palace on fire and burning it down. Also, the Red Army would not be able to get it, would not be able to capture it, would not be able to get any of the resources inside of it. Scorched earth. So about so many things, Heinrici was actually correct. And again, he's not a hero in the sense that I would normally describe them, but he was a realist, and realism was in such desperately short supply in the last days, in the last year of World War II, in the Third Reich. All of his predictions about what would happen militarily all came 100% true. Now, how he survived the war is interesting, because after all this happened with Goering, after all this happened in the bunker, he was relieved of his duties, and he was, basically fired. And so when the Battle of Berlin was coming to its end, he had been terminated and fired. So he actually wasn't there when the city fell. He never had to surrender. Gotthard Heinrici never had to surrender. He basically lived the end of the war on the sidelines. He was never convicted or put on trial at Nuremberg, because why he easily could have been, I think there were plenty of war crimes that he probably could have been charged with. I don't think he would have faced the fate criminally of Hermann Goering, who was convicted on all 4 charges, crimes against humanity, amongst other things. Heinrici probably did commit crimes against humanity. At least the soldiers underneath him did. If this was a case of the mob, it would have been a RICO case against him, where the underlings were committed for the crimes of, or the man in charge is committed for the crimes of the underlings. But that never happened. So what happened to Gotthard Heinrici after the war ended and after the Allied powers took over Germany? Well, very simply, he went to work for the United States. And this happened with a lot of Nazi generals. Given that he wasn't implicated in any of the war crimes and was not put on trial at Nuremberg, the U.S. basically put him to work and drew information from him on how the Nazis operated during the war. And his information actually wound up going back to the trial at Nuremberg and actually wound up helping to convict some of the Nazis who were being charged with these horrific and audacious crimes of the Holocaust. Gotthard Heinrici lived until 1971, till the age of 85. He lived a very quiet existence for the rest of his life, which would make sense because, as that historian said, he had all the charisma of a 20-pound sack of potatoes, which never changed. So there it is, Gotthard Heinrici, the general who Hitler despised but couldn't do without. The one who told him the truth when nobody else would. I would say he politically paid a price for it, but he never was politically involved. He was involved in war crimes, so he's not off the hook. But this is a man who's not afraid to tell Hitler the truth. It made him really only one of two men who was able to do that. The other one's a lot more famous, of course, that's General Erwin Rommel, whose troops were not in a place where they were committing war crimes against the Soviets because his Africa Corps were in North Africa. Totally different scene. He did not have the opportunity to commit those war crimes, whereas Heinrici and his men did. So anyway, that is it for today's episode. Tomorrow I'm going to come to you with another American governor, this time on the other side and the other party. It's going to be in a place where you would least expect it, in a career that virtually nobody knows about, and even an after political career that nobody knows about that is remarkable in its own right. So anyhow, see y'all tomorrow. Peace out, homies.